Well, for a broader look at what the US economy endured in 2020 and what we can expect this coming year, I spoke with Phillip Braun. He's a professor of finance at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. And he began by talking about how the arrival of the COVID-19 vaccine will affect economic indicators.
My expectation is it's going to take all of 2021 to roll out the vaccine. So I expect that economic growth and employment are going to go down into 2021, possibly, definitely the first quarter and possibly the second quarter, putting us into another recession before we come out of it at the end of 2021.
And we have seen some predictions. I mean, according to McKinsey, they are expecting a muted recovery, as are a lot of analysts. And they're saying that some of these hardest hit sectors may still not be where they were in terms of their contribution to GDP levels. They won't be at that pre-2019 level for more than 5 years. Do you agree with that? And what sort of consequences come with this very sort of muted, slow recovery?
Yeah, absolutely. The U.S. economy has become disjointed with the big shock from the pandemic. And it's going to take a while for things to unwind, not just from the first shock, but from the second pandemic spike. And I don't see the overall economy really getting back to its pre-pandemic levels until late 2022. And then sector readjustments is going to take a lot longer than that. Maybe a little bit quicker than 2025, but it's definitely going to take time for the economy to readjust from these huge shocks to employment and spending and economic growth.
And this certainly isn't a typical recession. Obviously, this is a health crisis fueled recession. So as you look at some of the underlying fundamentals in the US economy or some of the bright spots, what stand out to you as what really could be more resilient for the US economy?
It's a very difficult question to answer, right? The only bright spot has really been e-commerce. So the question is, well, that has a negative effect on the standard retail outlets. So the question is, will the standard retail outlets be able to come back from this pandemic, or is e-commerce going to continue to simply dominate and wipe them out? So whether the e-commerce sector rising so quickly is good or bad, it's hard to say. But I would say overall, it's hard to find a bright spot and from these shocks from the pandemic.
And it certainly doesn't help that in the middle of the pandemic, we are now also in the middle of a transition of power, so a lot of reorganization at the political level as well. What do we know about President-elect Biden's priorities going into 2021?
I know he wants to readjust the tax rates, and he wants to move on climate change. But I think I think his economic advisors are going to advise him to wait on that until 2022, because the negative effects of tax increases and negative effects of increased costs for corporations for mitigating climate change will just be negative factors that'll affect the economy too much in 2021. So I see that being delayed until 2022.
And as we've seen in other parts of the world, in terms of this recovery that people are hoping for, it does seem to be uneven, and it does seem to be exacerbating income inequality. What are your thoughts on the trends that you're seeing in the US in terms of the possible recovery and what that means for the wealth gap?
The wealth gap is only getting worse because of this pandemic. Then that's because the stock market is rising so dramatically, while the real economy is only sluggishly moving along. So one thing Biden could do in 2021 is try to narrow that gap by taxing returns on financial instruments more heavily. So increasing the tax on capital gains and dividends would help us move back in the right direction for income equality. So that it is making it much worse, unfortunately, and it shouldn't be this way. The stock market is not an appropriate indicator to how well the economy is doing. Indicators like employment, unemployment, economic growth, those truly measure the state of the economy, right? And if you look at the employment figures, the employment figures show that 10 million more Americans are unemployed today than before the pandemic. Those are real numbers, and that's real suffering.